Hi, I'm Dan Gosling, the early modern legal record specialist at the National Archives. And the document we have out here is one of the documents relating to the fall of Thomas Wolsey in October 1529. And it's an indenture between Thomas Wolsey and Henry VIII. Thomas Wolsey was Henry VIII's right-hand man. In 1515 he was made Chancellor of England, and he was already a Cardinal and Archbishop of York. So for nearly 15 years he reigned supreme as Henry VIII's favourite. So this document has a National Archives reference E30/1458, and it's an indenture, and what that means is at the top of the document there is a wavy cut. So this copy is actually the King's copy, and we know that because it's signed by the other party, in this case Thomas Wolsey, and his signature's down at the bottom. So it says T for Thomas, C-A-R for Cardinal, and then E-B-O-R for Arborum, meaning of York, so Thomas, Cardinal of York. The other copy will be Thomas Wolsey's copy, and if you brought these two documents together, the wavy lines would match just like a jigsaw and coming together. And the reason they did this was because this was a legal document. So if one of the parties claimed that something in the document wasn't being upheld, or that a piece of land that they wanted and been granted wasn't being given to them, they could bring this indenture into court. The other party would have to bring their indenture into court, and you could put them together just to show that they were made at the same time and they relate to the same grant, and that both parties have agreed to that grant or trade. These documents are significant because they show us exactly how Wolsey's downfall came about in October 1529. The offence that Wolsey was accused of, and what he admits to in this document, is the offence of praemunire. And that was created in the 14th century by three statutes, and that's in 1353, 1365 and 1393. Broadly speaking, it was the offence of undermining royal authority. And basically what it meant was if you appealed to a court other than the King's courts in a matter that should rightly be heard in the King's courts, then you could be guilty of praemunire, could be charged with praemunire. However, the offence wasn't just for going out of the realm and taking cases out of the realm, it was also to purchase, say, papal bulls from the court of Rome, and those were deeds or documents created by the papacy, issuing grants, deeds, offices, and then bringing them into England and publishing them. And Wolsey's actual offence was going to the court of Rome to purchase a papal bull that claimed and proclaimed him legate alitare, legate for life in England, and then coming to England and publishing those bulls without first getting permission from Henry VIII. This document is KB 27/1073, and it's a King's Bench plea roll. In this document are detailed the two indictments for praemunire that Wolsey receives in October 1529.
Plea rolls are made up of several rotulets, or rot for short. These are individual pieces of parchment sewn together at the top of the plea roll, similar to pages in a book.
The first one here is Rex Rot 18, and at the top it says Michaelmas term, and then there's a memoranda that's on the 9th of October in the Court of King's Bench. Christopher Hales, who is the Attorney General, brings an indictment of praemunire against Thomas Wolsey. On the next rotulet, rotulet 19, is Wolsey's second praemunire indictment, and at the top here it says we're still in Michaelmas term, but now it's the 20th of October, so it's just over a week after the first one. This rotulet outlines a second praemunire charge levelled against Thomas Wolsey, that he presented the parish church of Gulby, Leicestershire, to John Allen, who in 1529 was Archbishop of Dublin, even though the parish church wasn't Wolsey's to give. What's particularly interesting about the offences that finally brought Wolsey down was that they're all historic offences. So these are all happening in the early 1520s, in 1523, and these King's Bench records weren't created until October 1529. So the first thing we have to ask is, was Wolsey guilty of these offences? And I think the answer is yes. He certainly went and purchased a papal bull from Rome and then published it in England, and he probably presented to English benefices. However, the accusation that he did that without Henry's knowledge is probably less true. The reason that these are being brought in 1529 is because Wolsey no longer has Henry's favour, and Henry has the ammunition needed to bring his former favourite down. Though Wolsey amassed many enemies and rivals in the 1510s and 1520s, it wasn't until his failure to secure Henry a divorce from his first wife Katherine of Aragon in the late 1520s that he really became unpopular with the king. To be fair, Wolsey really had an impossible task. He had the Pope on one side and the king on the other, and he didn't want to upset either of them. Henry, however, didn't see it that way.
Our E30 indenture shows this close relationship between Wolsey and the king, and demonstrates how Wolsey initially reacted to the praemunire charges laid against him.
So this document is particularly important when we're considering the fall of Wolsey, because this is Wolsey admitting his guilt of praemunire. So not only is the document signed at the bottom by Thomas Wolsey, but the text says, yes, I'm guilty of all of these things I'm accused of. So this document's also really interesting because it shows Wolsey trying to bypass the King's Bench case by submitting himself to the king and saying, yes, I'm guilty and you can punish me however you see fit. So the King's Bench action is still going ahead at this point. It starts on the 9th of October and the judgment doesn't actually come until the 30th of October. So this document's dated the 22nd of October. So I think Wolsey sees that he's guilty and tries to get to Henry before he is subject to the harsher punishments of praemunire in the common law. So at the top it starts that this indenture made between the most excellent prince, our supreme and most dread sovereign lord King Henry VIII on the one part, and the most reverend father in God, Thomas Lord Legate Latere of the See Apostolique, Cardinal and Archbishop of York on the other. The series E30 contains lots of really important diplomatic documents relating to the English and British Crown. So while this one is a document between Henry VIII and Wolsey, there's also lots of documents relating to the divorce or annulment between Henry VIII and Katherine of Aragon, and really important treaties between England and foreign nations, be that declarations of war or of peace. In the end, Wolsey sort of got his own way, because even though the King's Bench case concluded on 30th of October and said he was guilty of praemunire and therefore subject to all of the punishments that that offence held, so that included having to forfeit all of your goods and lands to the king, Wolsey was actually allowed to keep his lands which he held as Archbishop of York. As for Henry, he got his own way in the end as well. He annulled his marriage to Katherine of Aragon, he married Anne Boleyn, and he broke the English Church from Rome, creating the Church of England. As for praemunire, theoretically, with the English break from Rome, it should have ceased to exist. There's no longer that rival jurisdiction between church and state in England, because the Crown is the head of both church and state. However, praemunire persisted until 1967, when it was repealed by the Criminal Law Act. However, it didn't end too happily for Wolsey. After retreating to York after the praemunire charge, a year later he was accused of high treason for talking to the French king and allegedly trying to bring down Henry VIII. But he died on the way down to answer these treason charges in November 1530.